Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the second and final of the recordings for the World War I material. I hope you're all doing really well. I hope that if you've got questions about any of the content, whether it's the World War I stuff or anything, I hope that you get in touch with me to let me know so that I can give you some guidance and feedback on that. When we finished up in the last recording, we were looking at how the United States gets into the war, because the war lasts for not quite 3 years before the US actually gets involved. And so it's a kind of a roundabout way. Ultimately, though, even though many people in the United States, and even though the president himself, Woodrow Wilson, weren't terribly enthusiastic about getting involved, the decision really gets to the point where, as far as Wilson is concerned especially, his goals for American leadership in the world, really, can only be realized if the US gets involved directly. And so that happens in April of 1917. And from that point, the issue then becomes, how do you actually make this happen? So the United States today has a huge standing military, right? Whether you're looking at the Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, whatever. There are millions and millions of people who are active in the armed forces right now, and we maintain that kind of military size and military preparedness permanently. In 1917, that was not the case by any stretch of the imagination. The United States in 1917, if I remember right, had like the 16th largest army in the world. And so it was a huge, huge struggle to try to build the army up into size. The Navy was in better shape. There is no such thing as an Air Force yet. There are airplanes that can be used in combat, but there is no separate branch that is responsible for that. That actually doesn't happen until after World War II. And so the military needs to be basically built up from scratch in terms of getting soldiers, in terms of getting Marines, in terms of equipping and outfitting and training and disciplining, and building virtually every aspect of the military complex. You also have to kind of convince the American public that they should be interested in supporting the war. They have not been attacked. There has not been a direct threat to the safety and security of the American people. There hasn't really been a significant direct impact on the American economy. Yeah, there were instances of individual attacks on American merchant ships, that kind of thing. But by and large, the Americans were pretty insulated from what was going on in the war. And so part of building an army is going to be a draft. So there is a Selective Service Act. There is a draft that brings people into military service whether they want to or not. There are certainly volunteers who decide to join up just because they decide that for one reason or another, serving in the military is something that they want to do. Serving in combat in the military is something they want to do. But you also have to convince the broader American public to support the war effort in other ways. Because wars aren't just won by having people in uniform with guns. Wars are won with money. Wars are won by people working at home to try to advance the war cause, the cause of the effort. And so this is where what's called the Committee on Public Information comes in. And this is an agency of the American government that is created specifically to sell the war to the American public. And this is partially to encourage enlistments, right? So certainly part of it was, hey, you know, this is what's happening in Europe, this is why you should care, and this is why you should enlist for the US Army or enlist for the US Navy or what have you. But a bigger part of what's going on here is to try to raise money for the war. So you have lots of different efforts that are part of this agency, this entity of the US government. On the one hand, you have people who are working to write newspaper stories, you have people who are creating short films, you have people who are censoring information about the war as it's being distributed to the American public. And you also have lots of people who are speaking at public gatherings to try to encourage the American population to, work hard to support the war effort. And this can be in a lot of different ways. Liberty bonds, right, which are basically savings bonds that the government sells in order to try to raise money to pay for the war. Enlistments, obviously, part of it. The kinds of rationing and tin can drives and scrap metal drives to try to help power the war effort. One of the biggest parts of this is this sort of collection of as many as 75,000 people that have the nickname 4-Minute Men, who speak at gatherings, especially in movie theaters, delivering these short little punchy kinds of talks that say, here's why you should care about the war, here's why what Germany is doing is bad, here's what America represents that is good. Now, go out to the lobby of the theater, and we've got recruiters out there who will sign you up to join the army. We also have people out there selling Liberty bonds so that you can, put some money towards the war effort and help pay for America's ultimate victory. And so this is certainly an important part of that, because the war is a very, very expensive thing. In terms of 1917 money, it is $33 billion. So if you would multiply that by probably 12, between 10 and 12, you would get roughly the amount of money that it costs in today's currency. So $350 billion or so. There is also a government effort to kind of regulate the economy, to regulate the operation of American agricultural output, industrial output, to try to coordinate all of those resources to make sure that they all go to the war as needed, when they're needed, where they're needed, so that steel mills get all of the materials they need, so that soldiers get all of the food that they need, while still not hurting the ability for people back home to get what they need to survive. So you've got things like the Food Administration, which organizes schedules of production and transportation and food rationing. You've got the War Industries Board, which kind of does the same thing, just with raw materials and industrial output. You have, again, a draft. The Selective Service Act goes into effect, which registers 24 million people, men. Of that, not quite 3 million are drafted and put into the military. Excuse me. So there is quite a bit going on to try to make up for those kinds of shortfalls in America's organizational structure, in America's military structure, that need all those holes that need plugged in order for the U.S. effort to really work. In the midst of all of this, there is also this really ugly kind of undercurrent of prejudice, especially against the Germans. And this gets expressed in some really ridiculous ways, like, well, we're not going to call sauerkraut anymore, we're going to call it victory cabbage. Or we're not going to call New Berlin by New Berlin anymore because we're all patriotic and we don't want to sound like we're supporting the Germans. We're going to change New Berlin's name to North Canton. So if you knew it or not, North Canton's name prior to World War I was New Berlin. And because of the war, people in North Canton decide that they don't want to have that connection with the bad guy, with the boogeyman, so they change their name to North Canton. So those are silly kinds of things. There are, though, cases of much more insidious kinds of prejudice and discrimination and outright violence, where you see things like boycotts against German-owned businesses or businesses owned by descendants of German immigrants. You see outright physical violence, beatings, intimidation, vandalism, those kinds of things against people of German ancestry, against businesses with German connections and those sorts of things. And so it gets to be really, really ugly in many respects. But this is all part of that process of trying to turn the United States into put it on a war footing. And some of these are things that the government is directly involved in. The government is kind of indirectly involved in these sorts of attitudes against German Americans too. So the war itself, for the Americans at least, because again, for a long part of the war it's happening in the East, where Germany is fighting Russia, as well as in the West, which is primarily this line of trench warfare that stretches from basically Belgium in the north all the way down to the Alps in the southeast. And these trenches exist maybe a couple hundred yards apart from each other, facing each other, and they are static. So for years and years, the war basically exists in this range of a few hundred yards where nobody is advancing to any great degree beyond the line of the opposite trench. Millions and millions of people die in these largely irrelevant and futile exchanges of artillery and machine gun fire and poison gas and tank attacks over over land that is blasted and destroyed and empty of virtually all life. And it is one of the first wars in which all of the modern manufacturing and technology and industry are being turned in the direction of warfare. Certainly other wars, Crimea, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, right, any Franco-Prussian War, there were wars that used tools that came out of the Industrial Revolution. World War I is really one of the first times when modern industry and technology are turned specifically towards the use of weapons. So this is including turning airplanes into weapons of war, the invention of poison gas like chlorine and phosgene and mustard gases, which in some cases are debilitating, in other cases they're lethal. And so it is a horrendous kind of experience that will take mental toll and economic toll and social and political, and have ripple effects that will last for years and years and years after the war is over. And you can see some of the different kinds of technologies here, some of the different weapons that are either invented or sort of modified, I guess you could say, to serve as weapons of war. So you've got airplanes. Certainly they've been around now for about a decade, but they are increasingly used as tools for killing, in addition to tools for reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. The top right picture, believe it or not, is a tank. If you've seen modern tanks that exist in militaries today, it doesn't really seem like it has any kind of ancestry back to that thing in the picture, but that's an early tank. Machine guns, the men at the machine gun position right there wearing their gas masks. The trench warfare, though, was really pretty horrendous for people that experienced it. and you would be sort of stuck in trench life for a couple weeks at a time, in some cases poorly drained, poor sanitation, poor toilet facilities, poor food preparation facilities, poor cleanliness. People would get trench foot, where basically it was an aggressive kind of athlete's foot, where this fungal growth would literally eat the flesh and bone away from your foot. Lots and lots of serious problems in the experience of trench warfare. And this had been going on for years by the time the Americans actually get involved. The first Americans show up in Europe in October of 1917, but they can't really get directly involved in what's happening, partially because of disputes over how they're going to fit into the war effort in Europe, partially because there just weren't large enough numbers to make much of a difference, to make much of an impact. Ultimately, though, by the spring of 1918 and into the fall of 1918, the U.S. presence does play, whether it's a decisive role or not, is still open for debate, but it does have an impact. And in the fall of 1918, the Emperor of Germany, Wilhelm II, abdicates, so he basically gives up power. The provisional government that comes in his place tries for a ceasefire, an armistice, right? And that goes into effect November 11th, 1918. This is why Veterans Day is November 11th each year, is because it's a recognition of that event in history, which is the stopping of fighting in World War I. Because an armistice is not a peace treaty, right? An armistice is basically the different sides saying, okay, we will stop shooting at each other and sort of pause the war until we can actually hammer out an official kind of peace negotiation. And that process happens near Paris in a place called Versailles. And that's going to take a couple months to actually officially play out. And this is one of the big places where Wilson is pushing for a very particular view of the war, while at the same time bringing up the question of American involvement. The people that actually figure out the peace agreement are delegates, leaders from the US, Italy, France, Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, and Japan. Of those, the first four are the ones that actually really figure out what the Treaty of Versailles will be. And if you notice, there is a very obvious omission here, and that is Germany, right? Germany is not present at the Paris Peace Conference. Germany is not consulted, not involved or included in any of the conversations or discussions. Basically, the peace treaty is created and hammered into place and then given to Germany for them to sign. That's basically literally how it all works. It is a punitive kind of a peace treaty. Basically, it is designed as much as possible to punish Germany for being responsible for the war. Article 231 of the treaty itself literally says, Germany takes responsibility for all of the destruction and devastation and death and horror of the war itself. And this isn't fair, because Germany was not solely responsible for that. Certainly they were really, really important in the war, but Austria and Russia probably bear at least equal blame in all of this. And so Germany is forced to pay exorbitant amounts of money to Britain and France in particular, as payment for the war, as punishment. Germany's military, its navy, its air force, etc., are all severely weakened. The German economy is beaten into submission. The German military is almost obliterated. And though the people of Germany then have a very legitimate kind of gripe about the way they were treated at the end of the war. And this is going to be a fairly common kind of complaint that people like Adolf Hitler and others will use to sort of redraw the political map in Germany leading up to World War II. Certainly Hitler comes out on top, but he is by no means the only person in Germany who is pointing to the peace at the end of World War I as a major attack on German pride and a major attack on Germany's ability to remain a viable figure in Europe. Obviously, Hitler takes that in really disgusting directions, but in some respects, he is not alone in some of the ideas that he presents to the German people. So the treaty also takes into account these issues of nationalism, right? One of the things that they do is they chop up Austria-Hungary into tiny little pieces. So instead of it being this huge blob of an empire right smack in the middle of Europe, now Austria-Hungary has been carved into Austria and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and there will be parts of it that will be carved out to be added to Italy and Serbia and Romania. Bulgaria is created. Some of it will be carved into the Soviet Union. And there is also this idea of creating these neutral zones, these sort of buffer zones between traditional belligerents or traditional enemies. So Poland is created to try to separate Germany and Russia. The Rhineland, which historically had been part of German territory, it is now demilitarized. It's kind of turned into neutral space between Germany and France, all in the hope that they will be able to prevent countries from going to war because you don't have that shared border where things could flash up into the possibility of violence, right? And so you can see here in the kind of center of the map, the pink areas are countries that are created from scratch, and the green areas are territory that is taken from one country and added to another. So you can see there's a lot of change that's happening as a result of World War I, where countries are created, countries are recreated, as in the example of Poland. Countries are added to, countries are sort of spaced apart in sort of different ways geographically. So lots and lots of stuff going on as a result of the war. As far as the Americans are concerned, we're not involved. I mean, certainly Wilson participates in these discussions about redrawing the map of Europe. But the big thing that affects the United States is what's known as the League of Nations. So Wilson goes to Paris with a list of 14 different things that he wants to achieve at the Paris Peace Conference. And in some cases, he gets some of these things. In other cases, he decides that he will give up a particular goal in order to achieve what he calls the League of Nations. And the League of Nations is kind of a forerunner, a prototype of the United Nations that we have today. But the League of Nations was Wilson's pet project that said, this will be the thing that can prevent war from ever happening again. Wilson is a very idealistic kind of person in some respects. And he says, if we can create this mechanism where countries will talk to each other and hash out their differences face to face diplomatically, then people will never need to resort to war ever again. So what Wilson is hoping to do at the end of World War I is to eliminate all of the different things that can cause war in the first place. And one of the big ways that he believes that you can do this is through having that kind of face-to-face point of conversation where nations will be able to discuss problems, figure out solutions at the negotiating table rather than needing to send in armies to solve those disputes. Wilson is very proud of the League of Nations, but the US Senate, who is responsible for approving any treaty that the United States enters into, the Senate says we're not as excited about this. And the Senate refuses to join, partially because they're concerned with one of the requirements in the League of Nations that says every member of the League of Nations is required to defend any other member of the League of Nations that is attacked. And leaders in the Senate say, this is exactly the pickle that got Europe into the First World War to begin with. Why would we agree to sort of commit ourselves to defending the rights of 100 and however many countries there are in the world whenever any country has a gripe with another? We would be drawn into warfare. And this is a fairly legitimate kind of a concern. And ultimately, the two sides, on the one hand, leaders in the Senate, and on the other hand, Wilson himself, they can't come to any kind of common ground. And so the Senate refuses to approve the treaty as it's written in Paris. The Senate then agrees to a separate treaty with Germany, one that doesn't include the League of Nations. And so the United States never joins the League of Nations. Partially because of that, the League ends up being largely pretty irrelevant. And even though it limps along into the 1930s, it's never able to really fulfill the fairly naive goals that Wilson has for it. But it does exist. The United States is never a participant, and partially because of that, certainly not only because of that, but partially because of that, the League is largely ineffectual, right? So that's the sort of end of the American involvement in the war. When we talk about the 1920s, though, we will definitely be getting into some of the things that are consequences of either the war itself or that are consequences of things that the war kind of unleashes in American life. And so it's definitely going to fit neatly into that whole puzzle of American history, even though it sometimes, unfortunately, gets kind of overlooked or brushed aside in the rush to get to World War II among, a lot of history teachers and things. So that is the end of the World War I material. Let me know if you've got any questions. I hope everybody's doing really, really well. Our next topic then is going to be the 1920s. So I will see everybody then.